everybody. Welcome to this evening's session. And I'm very excited because we really are at a defining moment in healthcare. As we step further into 2026, the pace of innovation in medicine is moving faster than ever. But despite all the technological leaps and bounds, we're still facing a persistent systemic barrier. And that's a gap between scientific knowledge, clinical data, and real-world application. Today I'm really happy to introduce you to Nogafem. We serve as a methodological body, and we're dedicated to integrating sex and gender considerations into the core of health tech systems and medical technologies. We aren't just looking for minor adjustments, we're actually looking to re-engineer the system. So what does it look like for us in practice? Well, for far too long, we have been sidelined and not seen as a fundamental pillar of medicine. But if we take a systematic data-driven approach, we can directly tackle systemic failures such as delayed diagnoses or misallocated resources and preventable morbidity. But we don't stop at methodology. As an organization, we actively and voluntarily support the startups on the ground who are innovating in women's health, providing them with direct access to our global network, assisting them with strategic collaborations, and visibility within the global ecosystem. But before we dive deeper into this benchmark and explain what we're all about and why we've written it, our heartfelt thanks goes to, first of all, my co-founder and chairman of the board of Nogafem, Dr. Michael Seller. She and I have worked consistently, voluntarily for 6 years, building the case for women's health, and it's our lifetime mission. Thank you to our speakers today, and most especially to our exceptionally skilled volunteers. So without Isabel Grau, we would not have the report that is going to launch at the end of this month. Isabel brings over 2 decades of global clinical research and operational leadership to Nogafem. She holds an honours degree in pharmacology from the University of Queensland, and she's worked for many years in a global CRO consultancy firm, managing many teams across the Asia-Pacific market. Isabel's brilliant mind helped to compile the insights you will read about in our report, and she was actually the conceiver of the idea, the momentum equation in women's health that we'll discuss shortly. She's also pioneered our understanding of the Asia-Pacific as the next massive frontier for women's health, so please keep an eye out. We'll be hosting Isabel later in this year to dive deep into that market. Next, a big thank you to Tali Rafael, our data analyst intern, who has just finalized her studies in economics, entrepreneurship, and data science. Tali took the mountains of raw data and transformed it into real intuitive graphics that you'll see tonight. And finally, to all our women's health startups. We know how busy you are building the future of women's health, and we're incredibly grateful to you for taking the time to update our database so that we can share these insights with all the strategic stakeholders. But our thanks would not be complete without Rachel Bartholomew and Femtech Across Borders. Nogafem is proud to be part of this global women's health collective, which spans across 80 countries with 50 different initiatives, united in the mission of creating a global forum to address the underfunding, under-research, and lacking of innovation in women's health worldwide. So now onto our topic. Let's address the reality of where we stand in 2026. For years, the conversation around women's health was just around awareness, proving that we have a problem. Today, the evidence is unequivocal. Women's health is a top-tier medical, economic, and societal priority. Closing gender-based gaps yields massive financial returns and healthier societies. So we're actually almost done with the awareness phase, and the entire sector is transitioning to planning and implementation because the time has come for us to convert momentum into sustainable systemic growth. And as we look at this implementation, Israel stands poised as an ideal pivot for women's health innovation, because we have a highly agile, supportive startup ecosystem with world-class leadership in bioconvergence, marrying AI, deep data science, and advanced bioengineering, as well as therapeutics, to solve the most complex medical puzzles. But we have an even bigger secret weapon, and that's our centralized electronic medical healthcare record data infrastructure. We have decades of longitudinal digitized health records, and this is providing us with an unmatched platform to extract deep insights across a woman's entire lifetime. What the leading founders have to say in 2026 is really a recurring theme, that isolated point solutions are not what's going to create true value in women's health. It's about longitudinal, across lifetime care that's going to drive the real growth and value going forward. And yet, despite this incredible potential, we're currently in a severe state of misalignment. Why? Because the capital deployed does not match the market potential. This isn't us saying it. This is according to the World Economic Forum's latest Women Health Investment Outlook for 2026. Just 6% of private healthcare investment goes to 50% of the population. That's a big mismatch for an addressable market that's projected to reach up to $1 trillion. Not only that, but 90% of that 6% flows into just 3 areas: women's cancers, reproductive health, and maternal health. Now, don't get me wrong, these are crucial, foundational areas with massive global challenges and increased need for innovation. But the market also has to broaden to capture the massive $100 billion potential. And Women's Health Access Matters has done cost economic analyses to show that if all women receive the standard of care in just 4 areas: cardiovascular disease, where women and men are affected equally, osteoporosis, menopause, and Alzheimer's dementia, we can expand this potential market. What is exciting, though, is that while the funding might be misaligned, actually other critical gears are now finally locking into place. We see a powerful convergence of scientific and technology breakthroughs starting to align with rising demand and reimbursement certainty. So when you couple clinical need with a clear pathway for getting paid, you really unlock future growth. And the numbers speak for themselves. This market is growing at a CAGR of 16.4% through to 2030. The geographic landscape is changing, and the market is expanding beyond US and Europe to Asia Pacific and the Middle East. Investors are taking note. The latest Silicon Valley Bank report actually shows how much since 2019 investments have been deployed across all these areas. However, we are seeing a slowing of funding, and this is particularly in late-stage growth rounds. So the innovation is there, but the late-stage capital is bottlenecked. This brings us to the momentum equation. Right now, we are taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Why? Because we're relying on disjointed activity rather than a unified system. If we want to permanently move forward in women's health, we have to bring together a structured, coordinated ecosystem where all the stakeholders move together. Like any complex system, we have forces pushing us forward and pushing us back. In women's health, on the acceleration side, we have deep tech integration, which is starting to emerge, clinical breakthroughs that are happening constantly, and early stage investment that's really moving forward. But on the friction side, we're still battling the systemic bias, the data gaps, the ongoing lack of sex and gender integration into technology design, and a severe late-stage funding ceiling. So, we have plenty of brilliant players, but we need coordinated alignment. And in women's health, we have no shortage of stakeholders. From patients, clinicians, innovators, capital, and policy infrastructure, we all need to coordinate to translate these insights into action. And where's the catch? Founders are expected to be it all in women's health. They're expected to be innovators. They're expected to be researchers closing the data gaps that are glaring and building a database where there is no data. They're expected to be sex and gender experts and disaggregate the data. They're expected to close the biases of AI, the historical biases of the data sets. They're supposed to be managed care musicians and create new reimbursement pathways and codes that don't exist. And they must also be policymakers or make sure that their area of women's health gets priority when it's sitting at the decision maker and government table. And they must also be influencers, media and thought leaders. Well, they can't do it alone. And that's our message today. Forward motion is not a knowledge problem, it's a coordination problem. And what's missing is global institutional infrastructure that turns momentum into motion. We know that countries are already doing this. The Canadian federal government has stepped up and allocated dedicated funds for femtech, which means that institutional infrastructures are developing. Spain has recently deployed massive resources for women's health research and innovation. China recently launched massive ecosystem initiatives to direct capital towards women's health. So things are changing. We need to step up to the plate. Standards and regulatory pathways, and I think this is what we were discussing before, are needed to make sure that we're inclusive and prevent harm, but at the moment they're not mandatory. And there's a lot of catch-up that we need to play. And seats at the investor and policy tables have to happen. Now moving on to our questionnaire, we want to thank all our startups in the women's health tech arena. Those that contributed to our survey, we targeted 110 startups and sent them a company questionnaire involving information about the company, an overview of the technology type, the area of women's health they're addressing, their business model and funding, as well as doing desktop research. And we had a 51.8% response rate, which is up. Last year we had a 40% response rate. So year on year we're getting more and more startups to be included, and year on year we'll be able to do better data analyses. But in a snapshot, what is actually happening? Well, growth of women's health tech companies in Israel is accelerating. We've got a lot of early stage company formation, and they're progressing rapidly over the company life cycle, particularly over the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, 68% of our current sample formed their companies within 5 years, and 47% of the current sample formed them within the last 3 years. So innovation is moving. If we look at Startup Nation Central's data in terms of the entire life science sector, which includes 1,800 companies, and we look at how many companies were formed in the last 3 years, we see that women's health is expanding and growing, and depending on the year, is between 18 to 20% of the total life science sector, and it's only going to increase. In addition, if we take a snapshot of just companies that were formed in the last 5 years out of our data set, we can see that they moved very quickly to the pre-commercialization stage, which means that they're advancing through R&D and pre-seed stages very quickly. And this is a very promising sign for us. What we need to do is ensure that they now go over the hump and reach commercialization and scaling. In terms of our market, there's a maturity of approach that aligns with global trends. So whereas in 2024, 78% of our companies were addressing women's exclusive conditions, now only 60% are. It's a very fundamental 60%, but what is very exciting and encouraging for us is that almost 40% of our sample are looking at conditions that are different or disproportionate in women. Some of the health conditions that our companies are addressing are new. For example, mental health has surged. The number of mental health startups that are addressing mental health has increased due to the healthcare system's focus on mental health innovation. Breast cancer technologies have also surged using combination hybrid models with AI, non-invasive screening, and very exciting things to come on that front. In general, endometriosis has also increased. Fertility, pregnancy, postpartum, gynecological and vaginal health, urinary health has stayed stable. Autoimmune conditions we would have liked to have seen grow, as well as cardiovascular disease, which has stayed very, very flat. But neurological conditions are starting to emerge. So we're starting to see this broadening across all the companies. And this aligns with the global shift. Whereas the traditional focus is reproduction and fertility care, which is still important, we haven't solved all the problems. Gynecological conditions and oncology diagnostics are areas that are growing because they've got high historical exit values and early and accurate detection. Menopause and midlife is growing with cardiometabolic risk, musculoskeletal decline, and hormonal aging. And we're also seeing diversification because high burden underserviced conditions are getting more attention for innovation, and we're starting to see that the technologies are deepening. They're combining different technologies together, or they're looking at platforms. We asked the startups that focus on conditions that are different or more prevalent in women, how many of them use sex disaggregated data in their research methodology, and approximately 30% do. When we looked at their general R&D considerations, not just data, but everything that they do across the life cycle of bringing sex and gender into their considerations, about 50% do. But when we look at the end product, the actual technology design, in startups that are different in women, they take into account more what is the user preference at the endpoint product than the startups that are more prevalent. So that's where we're sitting in terms of sex and gender. In terms of product types, medical devices are still a very prominent part of our startup distribution of companies by product type, but they've dropped. They've dropped about 15% since last year. And digital healthcare applications that interact with the medical system, AI decision support tools, platform technologies, and hybrid device AI diagnostic or diagnostic devices have popped up. And while our therapeutic segment looks small, I must add a caveat that we did not target the therapeutic sector adequately, and we know of current startups that have pivoted due to new research into therapies for women's health, as well as startups that did not contribute to our survey. So therapeutics is growing. And what's more important is that our business models are changing. Currently, 50% of our startups are looking at B2B models, and another about 25% are looking at B2B2C models. And what this shows us is that we really understand that for long-term sustainable growth, the startups are realizing that there needs to be integrated care pathways. And when we ask the startups, who's going to pay for your product? Who's your business model purchaser? It's really encouraging for us that the majority are going through the institutional payers, be it healthcare providers, clinics and hospitals, or insurers. And for this reason, we understand that they are doing so because they understand that investors and payers are demanding this value. And now we're coming to the elephant in the room. What are we going to do about the funding inequity? The core of our sample, 44%, operate in the $1 to $5 million range, and that's cumulative funding. That's not recent raises. Only a small percentage of companies have managed to break through and scale past the $10 million mark. This is a massive capital lag, and it certainly lags behind the general medtech sector. And we feel that this is really not a reflection of poor innovation or weak science. Just the opposite. We have fantastic technologies that are starting to emerge. It's a symptom of the macroeconomic tightening. We know that investors are getting a lot more picky about endpoint reimbursement models, about clinical evidence, and therefore the later stage funding is slowing. And it's also a symptom of systemic investor blind spots as well as geopolitical friction. But we want you to know that the startups that are developing technologies are top tier. Our ecosystem is also led uniquely by women at its inception. So 81% of our solo founders are women, and 65% of our first founders are women. But the teams are very, very gender diverse when we get to most of the startups. In other words, what's happening is that we're having female and male founders 2 to 1, 1 to 2, and a very gender diverse leadership structure that is supporting the operational growth and maturity of our startups. Interestingly enough, of 3 co-founders, 25% are female-only co-founders. So the key takeaways is that we're gaining momentum. women's health is the growth frontier, and Israel has a differentiated platform for technology innovation that can really redefine care delivery for all patients. But to move the system forward, we need to coordinate and strategically realign. And we need to help our founders focus. Let's stop treating women's health as an optional and build a system that turns momentum into permanent, life-saving motion. Tech innovation is not just a snapshot. We discuss the sector evolution, the capital and innovation convergence, and the gaps in execution. We've had years of expertise, and we've included clear, actionable recommendation. We've done a global integration from insights of all the major global health reports. We've given you a unique perspective on integration and a roadmap with our human-driven insights, not AI-driven. The evolution is moving, the need is urgent. Please, let's move forward together.